Hi. So the psychedelics research meeting congress is starting tomorrow, and I should have my presentation on Friday, so I still have some time. But I just came back from the previous psychedelic conference in Sweden, Borealis, which was a really nice experience. And there I talked about how to evaluate the plausibility of psychedelic insights, because people take LSD or mushrooms or other kinds of drugs, and they have all wonderful insights about how this reality is the body of Christ, or we are forms of a single universal consciousness, cosmic loving consciousness, or that we are all fragments of God made of love and light. These kinds of mystical insights people get when they take certain kinds of drugs, or when they meditate, or might have them spontaneously. And what's interesting about this is that the persons usually take them as true. They feel that the truth has been revealed to them. But then some science believers, well, I'm sort of science believer myself, but I mean these like philosophical science believers, naturalists, who consider that everything is physical, like physicalists. They often think that these kinds of insights are delusional, because according to standard readings of naturalism or physicalism, there is no cosmic consciousness or God or anything like that. It's all just dead matter all the way down. Not like this matter here, this is emergent matter, but life is emergent according to standard physicalism, and what fundamentally there exists, like quantum fields or whatever, that's dead matter, not cosmic consciousness or anything. There's no God, no meaning in life, and so on. Oh, so okay. Few days ago in Sweden, in Borealis, I argued that this is not the case. That even if we endorse mature scientific theories about the reality, even if we accept scientific facts, it does not follow that there would not be a cosmic consciousness or all these other mystical insights, because everything is physical. But what is the physical? That's the question. Well, here, this is physical. This all is made of atoms. This is physical. These thoughts are physical. These sensations, they are physical, on the assumption that everything is physical, which is a philosophical assumption, and also based on empirical evidence. There's lots and lots of robust scientific evidence that consciousness is a brain phenomenon in humans. I mean, like human consciousness is a brain phenomenon. I take it that there can be lots of other forms of consciousness, but human consciousness is tightly linked to the neural correlates of consciousness in the brain. So it's biochemical, a biological process. So consciousness is physical. And what does this tell us about the physical? A really nice forest. You know the epistemic gap in philosophy of mind. That even if we knew everything that can be scientifically known about bats, we could not infer what it's like to be a bat. Or even if you knew all empirical facts about me, my brain and so on, you wouldn't be able to infer what it's like to be me. Or the taste of coffee or whatever. So, and nevertheless, these experiences are highly probably a physical process. So it follows that science cannot tell us everything about the physical. If consciousness is physical, what it feels like to walk here, if this is physical, and if science cannot convey or fully describe or capture or communicate to another person what it's like to be here, this process here, if we accept these two premises, it follows that science cannot tell us everything about the physical. And this is a really radical conclusion based on physicalist premises and science, scientific findings about scientific evidence about identity between experiences and brain processes, human experiences and brain processes. So it follows that there can be truths about the reality that cannot be scientifically known. So this basically leaves open the door for these mystical types of ideas as well, that, for example, the reality or the physical, what science models as the physical, is ultimately, for example, forms of consciousness. And you know, why is it that science cannot capture my experiences? It's because science is limited to modeling the reality based on observations. Science is all about models. Physics is about equations, mathematical equations, and they exist in the minds of us, this animal species here. Those equations wouldn't exist, and all the scientific models, they wouldn't exist without this mammalian species who has constructed them in their mind. So I'm trying to get to my actual topic. I think I need to get my cat out of the back. Let's see. Yeah, the point is that I was arguing in the Borealis conference that mystical insights can be compatible with naturalism and especially science once we understand that science only models the reality. And now, here is the cat. One can do it like this. In the next conference, which is starting tomorrow, this is Nova, my cat. The idea is to talk about how could a mystical experience tell us about the fundamental nature of reality. So it is kind of like a sequel to the Stockholm talk, where I talked that mystical insights can be compatible with science and naturalism if we understand them as claims about the nature of reality beyond our scientific models. Like you could say that a transcendental nature of reality. some school children there making noise. So yes, and now the sequel, starting tomorrow or on Friday, day after tomorrow, the topic is how could a mystical insight, no matter how it's facilitated, drugs or meditation or spontaneous, makes no difference, how could it reveal us the nature of reality, the fundamental nature of reality. So this is now the actual topic that I was going to talk about, and the problem is that I don't really know what to say about this topic because I haven't prepared my presentation, and the conference team is they would like to have the presentation already, but I just decided to come here with the cat and think about it for a moment. So what do we mean by the fundamental nature of reality to begin with? There can be distinguished two senses, epistemic and metaphysical. In the epistemic sense, the fundamental nature of reality is the nature of reality independently of our conceptions of it, of our representations. To understand what this means, it is necessary. Somebody's going with their bike there. It is necessary to understand that what we perceive as the physical, it's just our ideas, like experiences. If I say that this is the physical, like this is experiences. This is consciousness. I don't have any evidence for anything else besides consciousness. Of course, the cat exists in its own right. When it goes to my kids during the conference, it will exist even when I don't think about it. So the cat is not dependent on my thoughts about it. So I'm not talking about George Berkeley's subjective idealism here. I just mean that all we know about the physical is based on our experiences of the physical. And this includes scientific models like the equations of physics. They are just abstract models, and the reality is not the model. So what the reality is in itself, fundamentally, so to speak, it's what is there out there beyond our models. So you can think of it like my perception of the cat or your perception of the cat. It's my perception or your perception. The cat is not the perception, right? So what is the cat? There it is. The cat in itself, beyond all my conceptions of the cat, that is the cat in itself. And we could say that is the fundamental nature of this cat. So this is the fundamental nature of reality in the epistemic sense. For example, that rock there, what it is, independently of my models of it as a rock or as like some certain form of molecules or atoms formed in a specific way, those are all conceptions in my mind. So what the rock is in itself, that is its fundamental nature. Its nature independently of me or any other human being or any other animal representing it. The cat also represents the rock in its own way, and the rock is not her perception either. So that's the fundamental nature of reality in the epistemic sense. And I will come back to this because it's really important for my own part, because I know myself directly through being myself. And now I don't mean self in any like metaphysical sense, like Buddhists talk about non-self and so on, the like old story. I'm talking about my own consciousness. And when I say my own, I don't imply that there is some subject that has the consciousness. That's just silly. There's this consciousness here, this experience. And this is it. I know. This is it. I am this experience. Or, you know, it's difficult to formulate this without using the word I or me. But still, this is it. This is what it is. This is real. I know. And I don't need to reflect on my experience to know its nature. I don't need to create the model of my experience to know the nature of the experience. Like metacognition is not needed to know cognition, you know. We are cognition. Consciousness. So this is really, really important because it entails that I can know the fundamental nature of this. This is it. If by fundamental nature we mean the nature of reality beyond our models and representations and abstractions of it. And in a mystical type experience or non-dual experience or a unitive experience, unitary experience, where the subject-object distinction dissolves, so to speak, this becomes even more manifest because in that state I do not represent anything. There is no thought. There is just experience, consciousness, awareness. And in that state I just am consciousness. And you could say that I know consciousness, my own, so to speak, consciousness, this consciousness, this process. I know it through being it. I don't represent anything. I just know I'm resting in pure present moment awareness, so to speak. Okay. And we'll get back to that. It's really important. Now it's so bird, so it wants to eat it. I don't let it. I don't let her do that. So now the metaphysical sense, the fundamental nature of reality in the metaphysical sense, well, that's maybe the more typical conception of the so-called fundamental nature of reality. For example, many people say that atoms are fundamental, or that quarks are fundamental, or that quantum fields are fundamental in physics. I mean, because they are that something from which everything emerges from. Like water, for example, is the activity, is the causal interaction between hydrogen and oxygen. That is water, and it can be reduced to what hydrogen and oxygen are. So this is like reductive physicalism, which I think is a quite plausible position, at least when it's not formulated too strictly. Of course, there's always like chaos and unpredictability in the universe. It's a complex system, but still, it's in principle, it seems plausible to argue that all these complex life forms, for example, here that cat, this tree here, kuusi, I don't know what it is in English. It's made up of atoms, molecules, organic molecules made of atoms. It's the same matter as everything here, and fundamentally, when it's like a funnel, like a pyramid upside down. So there is some kind of like singularity, or at least small number of entities at the bottom, wherefrom emerges a multitude of entities. For example, from something like 4 quantum fields, and all the particles emerge from those processes. And on this really fundamental level, we can explain this, at least in principle, in physics. So fundamentally everything is one, sort of, or at least 4, if there are 4 quantum fields. And this is the fundamental nature of reality in the metaphysical sense. And now I'm talking mainly of this physicalistic idea where the fundamental nature is physical in the sense described by physics, which I think is highly plausible. Of course, you also have like metaphysical conceptions of the fundamental nature of reality in this metaphysical sense, such as Brahman in Hinduism, that there is just one big cosmic consciousness or God. I probably annoy people who really know Vedanta by saying this, but it's roughly the idea that everything is just one single big consciousness and we are forms of that. So fundamentally, it's a bit like white light. This big consciousness is white light, like potential to be anything. And when it takes... well, that was interesting. When it takes the forms of these individual forms, like the cat or this experience, it's a bit like white light being refracted into colors, as in prism. So our brain, for example, would function as kind of like a prism that refracts or like divides the white light into like specific wavelengths, like specific like forms of reality. So white light, this universal Brahman consciousness, would be kind of like white light, and this perceivable reality is forms of that white light, like reduced into colors. That's one idea. That's metaphysical idea, like spiritual metaphysical conception of the fundamental nature of reality. So fundamental nature of reality in the metaphysical sense is that something which everything fundamentally is. That single one thing that everything fundamentally is. For the physicalist, it is the physical. Or more specifically, energy, quantum fields, whatever. Okay. So now the topic of the talk of the Congress starting tomorrow here in Turku. The topic is, how could a mystical experience tell us about the fundamental nature of reality? So we need to answer this question by considering the epistemic or the metaphysical sense of fundamental nature of reality. So in the epistemic sense of knowing the model-independent nature of reality, well, this is it. I know it all the time. I would argue that I know it all the time. We don't need any drugs to facilitate that insight. We might need meditation, and drugs could certainly be of help to realize that this is the fundamental nature of reality for this part of the reality. But what is important to notice here is that this is only a part of the reality. This is this specific form of matter, if you will, or this specific form of reality that I call Jussi Jylkä, or I call the cat or anything. This causal process here, I know the fundamental nature of reality of this part of reality, but it's only this part of reality. Well, the birds saw her, so there's no chance she would get them. Alright, I know the fundamental nature of reality through any experience. This experience here, this is it. I know the nature of this experience directly through being it. I don't need to model it, so I know its model independent nature. I know its fundamental nature. And this can be extremely powerful insight. For example, suppose that you take LSD, 200 micrograms, and you are not very familiar with that substance. And suppose that you get into this unitive state of consciousness, where the subject-object distinction vanishes. Oh, sometimes she gets stuck like this. Just a moment, sorry. And one could even, well, already this subject-object dissolution is extremely radical for a person who has not previously had it. Of course, like an expert meditator can basically be in that state all the time. The everyday mind is the enlightened mind. Well, it's just normal everyday reality, like day to day. This is it. Okay, I have, you should see it. You need to see it for yourself. But that can be a really radical experience, especially if it comes like suddenly through the use of drugs, when you are not necessarily prepared for that experience. With meditation it's safer because it comes gradually and you have like metaphysical frameworks and maybe guidance to support. But okay, when you have this unitive experience, there is empirical evidence, psychological data suggesting that it can lead people to believe that they have actually encountered the fundamental nature of reality. And they say then that affected by the experience, like deeply moved by the experience, that everything is forms of a single universal cosmic consciousness, loving consciousness. And I don't think there is anything wrong in saying this. I personally have these kinds of beliefs. But the question is now, could a person know that this is the case? In this unitive state of consciousness, it's likely to be a brain process. We have empirical data of mystical states and unitive states. We have data like the famous default mode network, that this notion of self is linked to activity in the default mode network. And when the activity of that network is reduced through meditation or the use of drugs, psychedelics, then one has this unitive state. So this unitive experience is probably a brain process. We can take this as a premise. So it follows that it cannot reveal the fundamental nature of all of reality. Because basically what the mystic, the person having this unitive mystical experience, the whole idea is that they have somehow become identical with the fundamental nature of reality, and thereby knowing it. But this is highly, highly unlikely given what we know about what happens in unitive states. The person having the unitive state doesn't dissolve into the rest of reality, and neither does any like brain activity dissolve. Like this mushroom here has dissolved. Mushrooms eating mushrooms. Isn't that wonderful? Creating new life. So it's from this perspective, it's highly unlikely that the person having the mystical experience would gain knowledge of the fundamental nature of all of reality. The fundamental nature in this metaphysical sense. Okay, but of course they still get to know fundamental nature of reality in the epistemic sense, as I have argued, and this part of reality, this is it. We have a glimpse of the fundamental nature of reality through being ourselves forms of fundamental nature of reality. I hope my cat doesn't catch a bird, because I might end up in trouble, because I don't want her to kill. Yeah, cats are wild beasts. It's a bit like funny to have them as pets anyway. Okay, but how? This is now basically the topic of the talk. How could it be possible? I have said that it's unlikely to be possible to see the fundamental nature of reality in the metaphysical sense through a mystical experience. I think it's highly unlikely given what we know about the reality. What, do you want to go home already?
Nyt et saanut sitä kiinni sitten joo.
But there are arguments to the conclusion that it could be possible, but now it appears that I simply don't have time to go into those arguments, because I have 20 minutes of presentation time, like on Friday, and this whole pohjustus, what it's called, like prep talk here, has taken me a half an hour, so I cannot really go into those. I was going to go into, for example, this Huxley's reducing wall idea of, like, it's exactly what I said, like the white light and the colors. That somehow reality in itself is some kind of like cosmic universal big consciousness, which gets reduced into specific forms through taking these specific forms of matter. That the brain reduces this cosmic consciousness into specific forms. And what psychedelics do, on Huxley's view, is that they open up the reducing wall. They make it possible for us to see the big consciousness that we are all forms of. But of course, this is like speculative. This is like basically like just it's a nice idea, but like all metaphysics, you cannot prove or disprove it. So basically, from a rational perspective, we should be agnostic about it. You can argue in this way, but you cannot show it to be true. So basically, no point in me in going into that whole topic and start debating it, like, or Walter Stace arguing that empty consciousness is a specific form of unitary consciousness, like a consciousness which is not consciousness of anything. It doesn't have any, like, it's not green or yellow or red. It's nothing. It doesn't feel like anything basically, but it's like pure empty awareness. Some people argue that this is possible in deep meditative states. Some people argue that this is possible through taking 5-MeO DMT. This so-called whiteout, a specific form of dimethyl tryptamine. I don't know much of the pharmacology, so don't trust me on that. But anyway, like 5-MeO DMT is a really strong psychedelic substance that can produce this kind of like empty conscious state. And Walter Stace argues, not talking about 5-MeO, but instead like classical mystics, the experiences reported by classical mystics. Stace argues that when there is this empty consciousness, then there is no principium individuationis, or what it's called in that's Latin, but like the principle of individuation. There is no such thing, because it's empty consciousness. It doesn't have any properties, so it follows by Leibniz's law that it must be identical with everything, because it doesn't have any properties to distinguish it from everything rest. Okay, nice, Walter, but really, if something feels empty, it doesn't follow that it is empty or without properties. For example, Thomas Metzinger has argued that this empty consciousness is a state of tonic alertness in the brain. And I think, given everything we know through science about the reality, it's highly likely that the state of empty consciousness is really a brain process and not the fundamental nature of reality. So that the person having the empty conscious state would basically be reduced to a quantum field. That's highly unlikely. It's much more likely that it's just a brain state. So it's not without properties, it's distinct from the rest of reality by having specific properties that distinguish it from the rest of reality. So this goes into deep metaphysics easily, all this principle of individuation and so on. But the point is simply that these are all highly speculative ideas within metaphysics. So I think we can conclude that it's highly unlikely that a psychedelic or mystical experience could reveal the fundamental nature of reality in this metaphysical sense. It's highly unlikely. It's much more likely that it's a brain process. But the happy news is that we can know the fundamental nature of reality partly, for this part. And for me it's not partly, because this is my whole reality. I don't know of anything else. My consciousness is my whole reality. And I can know the fundamental nature of my own consciousness. This process here, which I am. This process. This. I can know the fundamental nature of this. It's just it's just life. This is it. Just like going outside with a cat. This is the fundamental nature of reality. For this part of reality. And why should we want to strive for something more, Why have this a bit like hybris or this wanting to be God, I think Christian mystics have a valid point in emphasizing it would be heresy to say that you are identical with God, omnipotent being, the whole basically, the to be identical with that something which is underlies everything. That's hybris. That's how can a person be so arrogant that they really think that this small little mammalian species here evolved on the planet Earth, that they would have direct access to what underlies the whole of reality, everything. And the whole conception of fundamental versus superficial, what is the superficial nature of reality? In the epistemic sense, of course, it's perception. The superficial nature is this here, what I perceive, and its fundamental nature is, I had talked about this. But this is now we are talking about the metaphysical sense. The whole notion of there being some kind of lower and higher levels of reality. That this cat, for example, is a higher level of reality, or sort of more superficial, because it's not as fundamental as the quantum level, for example. Well, even in physics, of course, we can explain reality fundamentally as quarks and so on, but does it follow that quarks would be really more fundamental in some real sense compared to these trees, because they all equally exist, and these trees are made of quarks, atoms, all that. So the whole notion of fundamental versus what's the opposite? Superficial, higher, emergent. Maybe I would say fundamental versus emergent. it's also a conception in the minds of these limited mammals that we are. So I would question the whole plausibility of the idea of a fundamental nature of reality in this metaphysical sense. So that's basically the point. That's the conclusion of the talk. Where did the cat go? Ah, there it is. There she is. Hei Nova, lähdetäänkö kotia päin? Okay, see you later, bye bye.